Good day. My name is Kim Moody, and I'm your host for In the Mood with G C Moody podcast. And boy, oh boy, it's been a while since I've had a podcast. The summer kind of got away on me here, and both in some personal time and some busy times with the August 15th, 2025 package released by the Department of Finance, and then of course a bunch of other stuff, politically, and not that I'm involved in politics, but I certainly follow it, and busy with work, and I've got all the excuses for not doing a podcast recently. But I thought I'd do one today, given the fact that recently, today is September 26, 2025, as I record this, and within the last 10 days, we've had the announcement that we're finally going to have a federal budget released on November the 4th. Of this year. And I wrote a piece about that in the Financial Post. I've written a number of pieces about how disturbing it is that we haven't had a federal budget in quite some time. The last one we had was April 16th, 2024. And I find it disturbing that the Canadian public in general seems fine with that, or they just carry on. And I query as to why, and I wrote a piece on that as well with respect to financial literacy, and how a lot of financial issues get kind of numbing for the average Canadian who are not financially literate. But it's disturbing to me that Canadians in general will accept billions of dollars spending here and billions there, and we don't have a budget, and things that are just, and I'm not even getting to any of the other political issues today, such as the recognition of Palestine, which I find rather disturbing, but I won't get into that. I'll focus my comments on what I know best, which is tax and economic matters, and the fact that it'll be 567 days without a budget when it's finally released on November the 4th of this year is unacceptable to me, and it should be very unacceptable to most Canadians. And the reason why is because we need transparency and accountability as to how our federal government is spending our precious tax dollars. In 2024 fiscal year, there was about $550.5 billion collected by the federal government in federal revenues. And, ever since we've had Confederation in 1867, there's been an annual budget released. The only exception was 2020 with COVID, which in my view was completely unacceptable. And now we had a significant delay this year. And when you think about that history from 1867 to present day, we've had a First World War, we had the Second World War, and in between the world wars, we had the Depression, the Great Depression, and then following World War II, we had, Reconstruction and significant geopolitical events around the world that, followed as a result of World War II followed. We had the Cold War, we had, you could just go on and on and on in terms of all the geopolitical events that have happened, and some of them are very, very significant. And so for a delayed budget because we had a spring election, and the new government needs to have some time, that's total bullshit. We need transparency immediately. There's no reason why, in my view, a spring budget couldn't have been presented right after the election, sometime in June, for example. Or we could have had a summer sitting of Parliament to present a budget. But now, instead, it's going to be November the 4th of this year. That is completely unacceptable. And God willing, it'll be one of the last times, and hopefully the last time, that we see a significant delayed budget. And for those that need a reminder, the government's fiscal year starts on April the 1st of every year. So in other words, it ends on March 31st. So for this year, we haven't had a budget, but on November the 4th, the fiscal year is almost 2/3 done. not quite 2/3, but and for business owners or people that work on personal budgets, that's pretty useless. You don't present a budget when the year is virtually over half done. It's not worth, instead it's just reporting what has been spent and what might be done in the future. But for the current year, that's just an unacceptable delay, an unacceptable use of budget tools. And so now that aside, and I could go on and on and on, what can we expect out of this budget? Well, I wrote a piece on that, and I published it on earlier this week. And if you go back to what the Liberals promised in the budget, their election, there's some significant things that on the spending side that they promised, and I'll get to that in a minute. But on the tax side, their tax election policies were pretty thin. And so let's just review that. The first thing they promised was a 1% personal tax cut at the lowest tax bracket. And by comparison, the Conservative Party had proposed a 2.25% cut. And so 1% by comparison was pretty modest. But even without that comparison, it is pretty modest. It's even though economically it's a large number, it's over $3.5 billion charged to the fisc every year. For the average Canadian, it's worth about $200. So it's not a major thing that hits the pocketbooks of Canadians. But spending-wise, yeah, it's a big number that needs to be certainly considered in the overall spending stuff. But that 1%, that was their signature tax policy in the election policy platforms earlier this spring. And that was presented in the House in June of this year. And it received second reading in the House of Commons, but then Parliament recessed for the summer, and it's now sitting again in the fall session. But it hasn't received royal assent, even though the government is crowing hard that that people are receiving their, more money in their pockets. The only reason that's happening is because the CRA is administering this as if it is law, but it's not law. And so I'm sure we'll see some additional crowing in the budget about this 1% tax cut, which, in the whole scheme of things is not a big deal. So what are the other things that they talked about? Well, they talked about reducing the minimum RIF withdrawal by 25% for 1 year. Well, for those of you who know how RIFs work, there's a minimum amount that needs to be withdrawn every year. And so ultimately they wanted to reduce that by 25% so as to avoid seniors to have, which it's mostly seniors that have RIFs, because of course you have to convert your RSPs to RIFs by age 71. And so, that's a modest reduction in overall tax to the extent that you don't need to take that minimum RIF withdrawal. But since we're going to be at November the 4th, when the budget is presented, the year is pretty much over. I presume what they're going to do is present draft legislation or a notice of ways and means motion to allow that to happen starting January 1 of 2026. But we'll see, I guess. So that's the first prediction that I think we'll see. The second is they wanted to expand the labor mobility tax deduction by reducing the required travel distance for eligible employees from the current 150 kilometers to 120 kilometers. So in plain English, if you're traveling 150 kilometers away from your home in order to get employment, those travel expenses can be deductible up to a ceiling of $4,000 per year. And so the proposal by the Liberals, which they copycatted the Conservatives, by the way, a lot of the election tax proposals were copycatted by the Liberals copycatted them. And the Conservatives wanted to do the same thing, but have an unlimited ceiling. Whereas in this case, the Liberals they promised to consult on what that $4,000 limit should be. So they didn't propose a ceiling like, an unlimited ceiling like the Conservatives did, but they're going to consult. So I presume we're going to see some sort of update on that in the upcoming budget. The election also promised to introduce a new refundable tax credit, and they labeled it the Healthcare Workers Hero Tax Credit. I find stuff like this just unbelievably ridiculous, and it's going to be paid to so-called personal support workers, which I have no idea what that means. Is that nurses? Is that doctors? Is that, people that take care of the elderly and in assisted living facilities? I have no idea. But it would be worth apparently up to $1,100 a year. So will we see an update on that in the federal budget? Probably, would be my guess. They also promised to expand the critical minerals tax credit and the Canadian exploration expense deduction, which is applicable for the oil and gas industry. There's no details provided. Who knows if we'll see an update on that in the November 4th budget, but I guess we might see that. And then we also saw a promise to reintroduce an old 1970s tax shelter called the Multiple Unit Residential Building Tax Shelter. And in a nutshell, what that was it was introduced to try and increase multiple unit. It's not multiple use. It should be multiple. I should have said multiple unit residential buildings. And it was an attempt to try to increase the number of rental units in the marketplace in order to deal with housing problems. Because we've all, as a country, we've had housing challenges for decades and decades. This is, our current housing challenges are not new, although they've certainly been amplified by out of control immigration. But having said all that, the 1970s tax shelter introduced ways for investors to invest into a partnership and get accelerated depreciation on the underlying investments that were built by the partnership, so that ultimately the investors can get significant tax deductions early. There was a 1981 report published by the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation that was quite damning on this whole tax shelter business, and ultimately it was streamed out over time and fully eliminated in the early 1990s. I got into a little bit of a debate with a practitioner recently about my criticisms about the MERB tax shelters. The practitioner thought that, the number of units that were built back in the 1970s and early 80s as a result of this was material, and there's about 200,000 units that were built apparently, but the budgeted amount was a lot higher. And so, that report that I referenced earlier, the 1981 CMHC report, was quite eye-opening when you look at the history. And so my conclusion is, why are we doing this again? Let's learn from history. We don't need tax shelters in order to encourage housing, in my view. But I think we'll see an update in the November 4th budget on that. And then last but not least, they promised an expert review, is what they called it, an expert review of the corporate tax system. And again, this was a complete copycat of the Conservatives, who promised an overall tax review. They called it a tax reform task force is what the Conservatives called it, that they would convene a committee to look at the overall tax system and make recommendations, which, kind of warmed my heart, of course, because I've been calling, along with a lot of other practitioners, for tax reform for years and years and years. And so it's long overdue. And but for some reason, the Liberals, in their copycatting of their election policy, limited the review to the corporate tax system. And as I've been saying, both in writings and whenever I speak on this, not sure why they're limiting it to just corporate tax, because corporate tax represents about 17%, about 82 billion of the 550.5 billion that I referenced earlier of overall revenues, whereas personal tax, which is very integrated with the corporate tax system, represents about 47% of overall federal revenues. So why they would limit an expert review, which I don't even know what that means. Does expert review mean just limited to so-called academics that are friendly to the government, or what does that mean? But why limit it to just simply the corporate tax system, which represents only 17% of overall revenues? In my view, it's got to go further than that. So maybe we'll see an update on that in the November 4th budget. I guess we'll see. Overall, though, I think the government needs to go much, much further on tax measures. And, the CD Howe, which is one of Canada's preeminent think tanks, they put out a piece recently on what, and they do this every year, but they call it a shadow budget. And so they published what they think, the 2025 budget should look like. And it contains a lot of interesting comments. And so I'll just read you a bit of it here. It talks about that there should be some more certainty about the capital gains inclusion rate. And they'd like to see, blunt statements coming, not just from the Prime Minister, who published the suspension of the capital gains inclusion rate on the Prime Minister's website rather than through the Department of Finance. Like to see clarifications that is not coming back. And I agree with the CD Howe on that. I think we should see much more clarifying statements. They think that there should be a rescinding of the temporary exemption of home heating oil from the carbon tax. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure about that one because, right now the carbon tax, at least the retail one, is suspended. So it calls for the revoking or the rescission of the luxury tax on automobiles, planes, and boats, and I totally agree with that one. That is really poor policy. It talks about revoking certain income surtaxes and taxes on intercorporate dividends imposed on financial institutions. I won't get into the mechanics on that, but I certainly agree with that. It wants to revoke the tax on share buybacks. I totally agree with that one. It wants to phase out the tax credit for first-time home buyers and the first home savings account, which they say both of these measures demand and contribute to high prices for housing. And I agree with that. I think it creates artificial distortions, and in my view, it shouldn't. It goes on and on, and the bottom line is very thoughtful comments by the CD Howe. And I would encourage you to Google it, look for 2025 shadow budget, CD Howe Institute. Very thoughtful comments. Do I think that the government is going to pay attention to it? Unfortunately, I don't think they will, but they should. And so, just getting off tax for a second, and I'll circle back. But I'm very, very concerned about the spending announcements by this government. The CD Howe again came out with earlier this month, it might have been late last month, with updated estimates in terms of what the deficit might be. And they predict it could be as high as $92 billion. If we see the budget of November 4th come out with that kind of spending and that kind of deficits, wow. I mean, that Canada is in for a lot of trouble here. And unfortunately, a lot of this spending is being masked by very, nice and cutesy phrases. The one that PM Carney and his colleagues like to come out is, let's spend less, invest more. I challenge anybody who's listening here to tell me what that means, because I haven't been able to find somebody that intelligently tells me what that means. And frankly, what that means in my view, even though it sounds cute, is that it's a mask for increasing government spending. Because ultimately, this government's ideology is that government needs to be involved in your life. And government can really be a significant player in both your life and improving the economy. Well, I don't buy into that ideology in the least bit. In my view, and unfortunately, this is politics, but unfortunately, I think time and time again has proven that if government just simply gets out of the way and lets its great entrepreneurs, do their thing and allow for an investment in without bureaucratic roadblocks, that is a much better path in my view. But unfortunately, we're seeing things like, a new housing entity, a federal housing entity, which invests in quotation marks billions of dollars. We're seeing the new major projects office, which is going to pick winners and losers. Again, just get the hell out of the way, and allow entrepreneurs and investors to figure out what Canada needs. So I believe that the budget, even though it's being masked by this cutesy saying of spend less, invest more, is going to be massive. The other thing that I find disturbing, and I'll certainly be looking right through it, is Mr. Carney announced that they're going to change the way they budget by separating the capital budget from the operating budget. And I wrote a piece on that in March of this year when he first announced that he was going to do that. I mean, this is not a new idea. This has been going on in politics for hundreds and hundreds of years. But most recently, the Conservative government of Alberta, led by Premier Alison Redford, tried the same thing and rightfully got roasted big time. And it was a way to try to mask ugly deficits by saying, well, no, these costs over here are really capital, and therefore we're going to take it out of the budget and call it a capital budget, and we're going to show the deficit being significantly reduced because those are operating deficits, not capital. That is just simply an accounting trick, because the bottom line is, no matter how you characterize amounts, whether it's capital or operating, you're still spending. And you're in the government context, if you don't have the ultimate revenues to support that spending, then you got to take on debt. And lenders don't care whether it's going to be operational or capital. The bottom line is it's debt. So I find that very, very misleading, especially for the financially illiterate who do not understand this. Oh, it sounds good. We're going to balance our budget the operating budget within 3 years. Oh, that's genius. This guy must know what he's doing. No, that's just simply totally politics. That's misleading, huge spending. And so what I'll be looking for is, what's the overall spend? What's the overall deficit? Which again, in my view, I do believe C.D. Howe, where right now, because of huge government involvement and spending announcements, it could touch $100 billion, being the annual deficit. That's bad news for Canada. And I'm not the only one. There's lots and lots of people that are concerned about our overall deficits. And interestingly, yesterday, the interim Parliamentary Budget Officer was in a finance committee meeting in Parliament, and with some very blunt language, said that that the government's fiscal spending was just simply not sustainable, and it's stupefying is the word that he used. And the last time I saw blunt language from a nonpartisan party like that, or nonpartisan group, was from the Bank of Canada in 2024. And the report is still sitting on the Bank of Canada's website if you want to Google it. It was a speech done by Carolyn Rogers, who is a Bank of Canada governor. And, she said that our productivity is at, very, very low levels, and that it's time to break the glass, the emergency glass that's on fire alarms. That's what she was referring to. It's time to break the glass and deal with it. And in some blunt comments, made by the interim Parliamentary Budget Officer, very, very similar tone, but a little more dire. And he said the government's fiscal track is alarming, stupefying, and unsustainable. And I watched some of the clips. I didn't watch the entire thing, but I watched some of the clips of the comments made by the Parliamentary Budget Officer and his staff, and he made a point of saying, listen, when we say unsustainable, we mean it. And it's, so I think overall, I guess my comments is we need to get back on track fiscally as a country. We need to really control our spending, regardless of, the vacuous phrase of spend less, invest more, and regardless of the separation of the the operational budget from the capital budget. And we need to really think about tax reform, and not just corporate tax reform. We need some legitimate simplification of the system. We need both statutorily and administratively, and we need to think about what Jack Mintz calls big bang tax reform, both corporately and personally, in order to light a fire for our entrepreneurs and our investors in Canada. We've got all the tools necessary to do it. We just need to actually do it. And on the topic of Jack Mintz, he wrote a piece today as I'm recording this. He released it in the Financial Post about the need for tax simplification. And I totally agree with him. So with that, I think that's my comments today. I'll certainly be keeping my ear to the ground on any other inevitable leaks that come during the budget process, which is another topic for another day. The whole leaking of information to the media, which this government has been known to do regularly, is something that is inappropriate. In my view, budget secrecy should be sacrosanct, but unfortunately that just doesn't seem to be there today. But a topic for another day. I'll be keeping my ears to the ground. In the meantime, thanks for listening, and if you can do your part to help improve the financial literacy of Canadians overall, please do it. As a country, we need it. Thanks so much. All the best. Bye now.